Hi everyone, I'm Jess, and to say that I've had some free time on my hands in the last few months would be an understatement, and to say that I've had a lot to think about over the last few months would also be an understatement. And if anybody's ever, unfortunately, tried to bring a problem to me, you know that my first instinct is to try to solve the problem. So I've thought and I've thought and I've thought, and one of the ways that I'm trying to make a difference is to talk about one of my biggest passions, which is voting. So I'm utilizing a platform that I used to use in a previous life at a job and talk when I talked about Microsoft licensing and technology. I used to do these weekly videos. So I am revamping the format. So welcome to Voting 2-Minute Warning. So in thinking about putting these videos together, my goal is to make a video weekly up until the election. So we're about 16 weeks away from the election. I'll probably mention this date several hundred times throughout our time together, but November 3rd, 2020 is the next general election, and that's the big one. There are primaries that are still happening before then that were pushed back due to the pandemic. We'll talk about that a little bit later. I'll give you some dates on ones that are still out there. But in thinking about doing these videos, I really started to think about the three pillars that I want to address. And the first is the why, right? So I talked a little bit about my why I'm doing this video. But what I want to also talk about is kind of the big why, right? Like, why is voting so important? And then we're going to focus our energies a little bit tighter and talk about the individual why. So why is it important to you, and why should it be important to you? Then we're going to move probably next week into how. So the actual application, the actual logistics around voting. What does that mean? How do you do it? All those types of things. And then I also want to focus on overcoming obstacles. So let's say that you've decided you do want to vote, but there are things standing in your way that are preventing you from being able to, right? And they could be any number of different things. I also want to start to talk about those things because I think as a community we can sort of band together to try to help alleviate some of those obstructions and start to move some of those objections away to get you the opportunity to be able to actually go out and vote. So I thought the why in talking about our country and voting was kind of apropos. We just celebrated the 4th of July. And when we think about the 4th of July, that's really the birth of the nation. That was when we declared our independence from Britain and said we're going to be our own nation. And you can read up on a lot of different reasons that happened and a lot of different reasons that the country was established the way it is and the people wanted it to be this way. But the one I'm going to focus on is voting. So if you think about our lives, and I wasn't there, but our lives with Britain, it was a monarchy ruled by a king, right? And even the derivation of the word monarchy means, ruling alone, right? So if we think about the monarchy as a country, we decided we're not doing that, right? Nobody's going to be appointed, based on who their parents were or their birthright and things like that. We're not assigning somebody the job. We want the people to choose who's going to be the leader of the country. And from there, we also put extra parameters in place to make sure that no one person had complete control over the country. And that became Congress. So that's the Senate and the House. And those folks were put in place to be checks and balances for the president. I mentioned both of those governing bodies because they are all people that we vote in as a nation to their jobs. So, and we think about kind of the beginning stages of voting. It all came out of a really complex and very hard-fought war for the revolution. And when we think about what came next, the idea of voting was a great one, right? I mean, it had some, great baseline, but with most things, it wasn't completely baked. So I read some statistics that probably in the first elections, only 10 to 20% of the population were able to vote. Basically, you had to be a landowner, and you can only imagine who owned land at that point in time in our lives. So somebody like me, I'm not able to vote at that point. Somebody of color, not able to vote. There were so many restrictions on who could vote at that period of time that, like I said, it only ended up being about 10 to 20% of the country. Now, as a nation, we woke up this morning in 2020, and if you are 18 years old on or before November 3rd, you can vote in that election as long as you're a citizen and you have met certain residency requirements in your state. But as long as that happens, you can vote. But that didn't come easy, We have now spent hundreds of years getting to the point where all of us have the right to vote. If we think back to sort of the ways that things have gone, it wasn't until 1920 that women were given the right to vote. And even people of color were given the right to vote in the late 1800s, but because of loopholes that were put into the system, they weren't actually able to acknowledge that right and actually vote until 1965. Can you believe there are people that you probably spoke to this weekend that were alive when that happened, right? We're not so far removed from people not being able to vote. So I think I wanted to lay that foundation, maybe air a little bit of our dirty laundry, because I think right now voting feels automatic, right? It feels like something, of course, we have the right to vote, but it hasn't always been that way. And when I tell you that people have fought and died and battled to get those rights, so that now when we wake up in the morning, we have that right. Our voices can be heard. That's not being dramatic. That is the reality of how it's come to be. So that's the big why, right? This is a big deal. Countries all over the world don't necessarily have this right. We do, right? And people would crawl over broken glass to have this right. And I think it's important that we kind of establish that, because maybe we are a little bit too far removed from the battle that it took to get here to think about how important it is that we have this right. Okay? So that's the big why, right? That's the nation. That's the why. Now let's talk about us as individuals. So from an individual perspective, I like to talk in metaphors. So let's talk about it like this. So I am the owner and sole proprietor of this entity called Jessica, right? I make the decisions, right? Whatever happens in a day, I make those decisions, right? Good or bad, and they've been good and bad throughout the course of my life. But I'm going to make a decision based on the way I want to live my life. And frankly, whoever's watching this video now, chances are you have no desire to live your life exactly the way I do. And that's great. That's what makes us all different. But keep in mind that even though I run the show for me individually, to continue the metaphor, there's a board of directors around us that are making decisions that either help or hurt my ability to live my life the way I want to, right? So when you think about those elected officials, for all intents and purposes, they are the people that work for us, right? They are part of this entity that I'm trying to make the best life possible for myself, right? So when you think about voting, think about it like you are a part of a hiring committee that has been tasked with hiring people like the CEO or the HR department, or whomever you want to think about from an analogy perspective. But that becomes the Senate and the House and the president and your mayor and the governor and the controller and the people that you get to vote for into power are endless. And what you need to start to think about is that they're going to make decisions based on you. And keep in mind, we're voting by committee, right? So your singular vote, I know sometimes it feels like it gets lost, but it doesn't, right? You're putting a stake in the ground in terms of who you want to be representing you as you go out into the world and make decisions for you. And I realize sometimes it works out and sometimes it doesn't. But here's the cool thing, right? It may not work. You may not get the senator you want when you vote, but maybe you got the president you wanted, or maybe you got the governor you wanted, right? At least you've got somebody out there making decisions for you based on your individual goals, right? So that's the part of this I want to empower you to do now. I want you to think about your why, your individual why. So I want you to think about the top 3 things that motivate you or keep you up at night or start you thinking about what's important to you, right? And I'm not asking you to put that in the comments or tell me what they are. If you want to talk about it, we can absolutely talk about it. But I want you to think about that for you as an individual, right? And keep in mind, your number 1 might be my number 7, or it may not even be on my list, right? That's what's important. It doesn't make it any less important than my stuff is or your stuff is. It's just different. And that's what makes it so important that you as an individual take action to vote so that your interests are taken into account. And those interests are so varied, we couldn't even list them all here, right? Your number 1 concern could be your kids or healthcare or the environment or your house or whether weed is legal in your state. All of those things are important to some people, not important to others. But what becomes important is your why. So start to think about that between now and next week. What is your why? What are the three? Just pick three things that, man, once you start thinking about them, you're up all night. You're thinking, you can't quite get over, and you can't let those things slide, right? They are that important that you're really, really passionate about. And that'll help, I think, kind of focus your energies into who you want to vote for, and just at least taking the action. All right, so in leaving you, I'm going to leave you with a couple of dates and a couple of pieces of information. I talked about the right to vote. One of the things that becomes extremely important is that you register to vote. Think of it like this. You have got to reserve your seat at the table. If you do not reserve your seat at the table, you're not eating. So take some time. If you haven't registered to vote, take that action, right? Nothing happens once you do that, right? You're just registered. That means you have reserved your seat, and you can go to the dance if you want to. That's completely your decision. Okay, so register to vote. There are registration deadlines looming in order to participate in some of the upcoming primaries. I wrote some of these down. We've got registration deadlines coming up on July 6th for California, Arizona, and Ohio, and July 7th for Maine and Tennessee, July 8th for Missouri, July 9th for Hawaii, and July 12th for South Carolina. Now, those are to vote in the primary. Okay, you still have time to vote in the general election, so get registered. Okay, you've just got the only public information that will happen once you register is that somebody would be able to find out what political affiliation you're in. That only matters for the primary, so choose what you'd like, but you do for the primary have to vote your party, which is a whole other situation, but it's just the way it is. So make your decision. That'll be information. Then the only other public information that exists is whether or not you vote. So also keep in mind, if you have registered previously but you're not sure if your registration is still valid, take a look at registration page. Now, I'm a kid of the 90s. I'm going to direct you to rockthevote.org because as a kid, I always wanted to be involved in Rock the Vote. I thought that was pretty awesome. So take a look at that site. I know it's geared towards younger folks, but let's be young for a minute. So check that out. It'll give you all the information you need about your states. We also have some upcoming primaries that were pushed back due to COVID. So Delaware, New Jersey, you are up July 7th. You've got primaries coming up. Louisiana on July 11th. Alabama and Texas, you've got runoffs on July 14th. And Maine, you are up July 14th also. So keep those dates in mind. We will talk next week a little bit about how this all happens and about how you can go. But if you could do nothing else today, go grab your seat at the table, register to vote. Thank you, everybody. I'll talk to you next week.